In this video, I'm going to go over a couple of different ways that we can create relationships between objects, such as one driving another one. Two ways we have to do that we'll use regularly in animation are constraints and parents. So both of these two technical setups will allow one object to drive another, but the way that we use them will be quite different, and I'll go through some examples here today. So first, I'm going to go over constraints. What I've done here is created two spheres, which are completely independent at the moment. I just created one, renamed it parent, duplicated it, named it child. So they have no relationship to one another at the moment. I'm going to now select the parent first, and then the child second. So I want the parent to be controlling the child. And then under the animation tab here, we will find the constraint menu. There are a few types of constraints which we can go over, but today, at the moment, I'm going to speak about the parent constraint. So this will basically do both a translate and a rotational constraint, so it will fully be controlling the other. One thing to be mindful of is this maintain offset. If I have this on, it means that the two objects will remain where they are at the moment when I create the constraint. And if I have it off, the child will snap to the parent. So I'm going to leave it on here, and I'm going to say apply. So now you can see some blue channels came up here. That means that there is now a connection, and it's created within the translates and the rotates because we did a parent constraint of both of those. So if I deselect here, you can see that my parent has nothing colored in its channel box, but the child does. So now, when I move the parent, you can see that the child follows along. I can key my parent wherever I want, and the child is going to follow. Now, if I were to set a key on the child, what's going to show up is a parent constraint blend parent. So this little node appears, and what this is going to allow us to do is determine whether or not the child is going to continue following the parent, or how long it's going to be following the parent for. So when it's set to 0, which it is now, you can see that it's no longer connected. If I set this to 1, now this is connected. So this constraint system gives us basically an attribute that we can key on and off to determine when we have a connection happening. So because I've turned it on here, it's on through the whole beginning. And say the next frame I want it off, I'll just set another key here, set the key there, turn it off. So now what we've got is this following, and then if this continues to animate back here and over here. So now they're following, and then it leaves it behind. So this is really great in a situation where you might want your character to be picking up a cup, holding it for a while, and then putting it back down on the table and leaving it be. You would put a parent constraint from the hand onto the cup, and then you would key that constraint off. So there are a couple things to keep in mind, however. Let's just, as an example, I will not turn this off. So we'll keep this connection happening. So on this frame, I pressed S and I keyed the position of the child in this pose. So that means it's basically stored where this position is on the channels of the object. Now, I've still got it constrained, as you can see in the blend parent here. So let's say that we go forward again, and now of course our child is following here. Now if I just go to frame 60, of course we can see that our child has moved up here, but I didn't set a key. So it hasn't really stored this position. All it's knowing right now is that it's following this parent. Now if I were to just turn this off, it's going to pop back to the last position that I put a key on. So we can look at the graph editor here, and it's just got this one key. So this is the only stored position that it has. So I just want you to be aware of that if I were to put this back on. if I want to keep the ball now in this position, so it's still following this whole beginning way, we've decided to have it follow all the way to here, I'm going to press S. I make sure that all of these are keyed so that we now have a stored position, as you can see in the graph editor, of where this sphere is. So now if I turned it off, it's going to stay where it is. So just be mindful of that. Also, we would probably not want to be blending it off like that over time. We would probably want to just do it over one frame, but you can blend a parent on or off, parent constraint. So you can see here under the parent node, blend parent node, that we've got a percentage of how controlled it is. All right, so here it's 0% controlled, but what I would probably do is have it on fully until there and then off. Just to give you guys an example, it is possible to have partial control as well. So if we were to, instead of having this be fully related, we could put it to 0.5. So now it's following but not 100%. You can see that the relationship is a little bit different. So whereas before the ball would 100% retain this distance, and just, here I'll show you as an example. Let's put the parent to 1. If I key here, let's go here. So I'm here, and then at frame 100 I'm going to move up there. You can see that the distance between the two balls remains exactly the same. We've just basically had the rotation happening from the parent onto the child. But if I set the constraint to 0.5 and 0.5, now the arc is a little bit different, because basically the weighted value of that constraint is less. So I would advise, under normal circumstances, that we just have it set to either completely 1 or completely 0, and ideally over one frame period, such as my example, picking up a cup and placing a cup back down on the table. Right, so if you have created a constraint of any type and then you decide that you no longer want this constraint, you can see it in a couple of different places. Underneath the object that has the constraint, which you can see again by the colors here, in the outliner, you can see that you've got this parent constraint node. So a couple things you can do are to either just select and delete that, and then your keys will exist, but you won't have a parent constraint anymore. So this is free to move around and be independent. Or, if I were to bring that back, you can also see under here, under the shape node, that we have a parent constraint. And you can select that, copy it, and paste it up here, where you can then again select the node in a different way and delete it. So those are a couple different ways you can get rid of constraints that you no longer want. Alright, so now I've just zeroed everything out and deleted all the keys so that we can try a fresh example. Say we want to do a similar thing, but we just want a point constraint. So these are the three types of constraints that we would generally use. Point constraint, which just constrains the translates. An orient constraint will just constrain the rotations. And then, of course, the parent constraint, which we just tried, will constrain both of those. So again, I'll select the parent and then the child, go to the constraint, and we'll go to the point constraint. In this one, I'm not going to tick maintain offset, just to show you guys what that does. So it will not keep the distance relationship here. So what you can see now is the child snapped to the parent. So I'm going to undo that because it's not what I want to do in this example, but just so that you guys can be aware of that. So if you, for instance, do want two objects to snap together and be in the same exact position and have a point constraint or any sort of constraint, just make sure you untick that. But here I'm going to just have that. All right, so now you can see my child has blue channels here within the translates, but nothing in the rotates. So when I move my parent, it will follow completely with translates, but then this one can rotate independently, and this one can also rotate independently as well. Now if I wanted to do an orient constraint just for the rotations, I can get rid of this point constraint, and again select parent then child. We'll go to the orient constraint, maintain the offset and apply, and then you'll see that we now have this orient constraint. So what this does is, because it's not following a translate, it's not moving the object around, it's just combining, if I put us into wireframe here, it's just constraining the rotations. So you can see that those are matching up. Now, in contrast to that example, where we had basically the child fully being controlled by the parent, and then we could decide whether or not it was on or off, now what I'll show you is what's called parenting, which is different from a parent constraint. So the outliner is useful in this case. So I've got my parent and I've got my child here. So a couple ways we can do this. In the outliner, we can just drag our child into our parent, and now you can see that it exists in a hierarchy underneath the parent. So if I move my parent around, my child is going to be following, which is great. It's what I want, very similar to what we had before. But the good thing about this is your child is still independent in the sense of being able to move around separately from the parent while still following it. So we could go here, and then I could move it up here and rotate it over here, and it's still able to move. Even here I can bring it closer, rotate it. So while still following the parent, if we decide to move it further, if we decide to move it around more and end this over here, that will still happen, but we have the independent control of the child being able to move in relationship to that. Now the downside of this is that we can't turn that relationship off at a certain point in time. It's always going to have the child following the parent and the child being able to move a little bit independently within that relationship. So if I wanted to use the same example as putting the cup on the table, if the parent were to put the child on the table and try to walk away, let's just remove that. So the parent put the child down and then tried to walk away. There's no way for us to disconnect them. The child is always going to follow. One really messy way you could do it would be to move the parent over here and then to move the child back, which would be what we call counter animating. So you're kind of trying to do the opposite move as what the parent did to make it seem like we're kind of staying in the same place, but ultimately you're not. That relationship still exists. So this would be a very messy way to try to keep something in place. So essentially, if you always want your child to follow the parent, then using a parent setup like this is great, and then you still have that flexibility to move the child within it. For instance, if I were to pick up an apple in my hand, and I want the apple to stay in the hand, but also have a little bit of movement around, like not be 100% locked to that hand, but you know, it does a little bit of rolling. Maybe when my fingers move, the apple moves around in the hand. That would be a great example. So we would maybe want to use a parent such as this so that we can move that apple around easily. It doesn't get too messy. It's not locked 100% like the parent constraint would be, but it's still going to stay in the hand the whole time. If I wanted to put the apple down later, I would want to set it up with a parent constraint.